Turned our van off the Pan American Highway and headed toward the volcano of San Vicente, towering above the town of the same name, the valley below. In June of 1983, our crew was moving into the town for what would be a year and a half of filming to document the day-to-day life of people living here in the area the American government had targeted for its pacification program, aimed at winning the hearts and minds of the civilian population of San Vicente. We were an instant and permanent attraction, a van full of gringo journalists with cameras, lights, sound equipment, and video gear. We're not here for a few hours. We actually live in San Vicente. The capital of San Salvador is only 2.5 hours away by highway, but it's another world compared to San Vicente. San Salvador is a modern city with an urban lifestyle, lush hotels, traffic jams, shopping centers, and all the electronic conveniences the press corps depend on to monitor the constantly changing course of the Civil War. By contrast, San Vicente is a small rural community, constantly buffeted by the daily reality of the war raging around it.
It's a small town. I got to know everybody who lived there, especially being a gringo who lived in the town. Inevitably got to know everybody, and everybody got to know you. The fact that we sat at the base of a volcano, which was the base for a large portion of guerrilla activity that went on, was also certainly unique. Many a time I went to bed at night listening to mortar fire going off, fire being returned. Many a time I woke up only to hear the soldiers being drilled outside my bedroom window. We never really lost sight of the fact, living in San Vicente, that there was a war going on, that it was being fought, that it was being fought very nearby. I lived in San Salvador for a long time. I could go for months without ever really knowing that the war even was going on. Maybe the power went out, something like that.
Our crew included 2 Vietnam veterans who were wounded in combat, ex-Ranger Ken Gomez, an award-winning video cameraman, and ex-Green Beret John Buff, who was also wounded while serving in the Rhodesian Army as a member of the Gray Scouts Cavalry Unit. Co-producer Richard Boyle is the author of the book Flower the Dragon and spent 10 years as a correspondent in Vietnam. Boyle has covered Central America since 1979. Writer Bruce Yeager has lived in and covered El Salvador since 1980, when he was wounded while covering a political demonstration. Photographer Milt Graham is the former personal photographer to President Ronald Reagan. He's covered Central America for magazines such as U.S. News and World Report since 1982. For me, this was the 4th film I had made on El Salvador since 1980, when I began doing television news coverage for ABC and CBS affiliates and ABC's 2020 magazine. We moved our crew into a small pension operated by the Panameño family. Don Godo was a school teacher, whose godfather is the Archbishop of El Salvador, Monsignor Arturo Rivera y Damas. Mrs. Panameño and her husband had 3 sons in the armed forces. Hugo was a lieutenant trained in the U.S. at Fort Bragg, Edgar a medic in the National Police, and Chepe a member of the Civil Defense. Their sister Laurie is a widow who lost her husband to right-wing death squads in 1980, leaving her with 2 young sons, Kiki and Almilcar. Olgi's husband, Hernan, was wounded twice in military service, then discharged without a pension. Neither Olgi nor Hernan were able to find any steady work, though both are high school graduates. 17-year-old Janet is the top honor student at her high school, but with the situation, her future too is bleak.
And for them to accept us the way they did was so loving, and then the caring that they had for us, to look out for us, and we would look out for them, and they would cook us breakfast, and we would go out and do little things for them. It was like they were our own family.
The fort where the 5th Brigade and the 20 American advisors to the pacification program were based was less than a block from the Panameños' home. Directly across the street from the house was the National Police headquarters. Another half block away, the National Guard garrison. The presence of all these armed soldiers came to be as much a part of our daily lives as if we were attached to their units. The first place where word of the war's progress is heard is here in the Mercado. It's brought by people who come into the market from the countryside, where the majority of the Salvadorans live.
They bring news of battles, massacres, air raids, guerrilla assaults, often as they're still happening. Military spies and the guerrilla's ever-present network of sympathizers or collaborators are all here, monitoring those reports, exchanged as gossip during the marketing. For under the mercado's hue and cry, the hawking of goods, there lies an undercurrent of information, rumor, fear, and fact that is their only barometer in the quicksilver shifts in the situation surrounding San Vicente. Reliable reports or rumors of a new round of prolonged fighting bring people here to stock up on beans and rice, to buy containers to hold water, and batteries for when the lights and power are knocked out. Even if the reports are false, the provisions remain tucked away in their dirt and tin shacks. The marketplace is also the most accurate reflection of the eroding economy of El Salvador. Maria, the woman who sells corn, explains.
It has gone up a great deal. Before we bought corn at 3 or 4 pesos per hundred. Now we're paying 12 or 14 pesos per hundred. It is just too much.
Among all the modern household wares in bright plastics and synthetic materials, the traditional ways of the people of San Vicente are struggling to hold their own. Machine-made items are rapidly displacing the crafts and skills that had been passed on from one generation to the next. But the marketplace remains at the center of life in San Vicente. It is where a few cents can still buy homemade candy, fresh ocean fish, a parrot that can talk, or maybe a tiny chance at the biggest dream of all, the national lottery.
¡Medio millón de colones! ¡Va al medio millón! 25,000 por digésimo!
For the older residents of San Vicente, the marketplace represents one of their last ties to a world that the Civil Wars changed forever. It is a remnant of a time when things were perhaps just as hard, but easier to understand. So they come here, not only to sell their humble wares, but to dream of those simpler times before the war ravished their beautiful Green Valley. The Salvadoran armed forces were in the midst of being overhauled in 1983 as the Reagan administration began pouring millions of dollars into training and equipment for the troops to combat the guerrilla forces. The backbone of the pacification program were these U.S.-trained troops called the Cazadores, or hunter battalions. The Cazadores' mission was to seek out and destroy the smaller, more mobile units of the guerrillas in their jungle and volcanic mountain ranges that served as their sanctuaries. That often meant utilizing their American-supplied helicopters to reach those remote areas. We were the first journalists allowed to go out on patrol with the Cazadores. On one of our first flights out to the countryside, this young door gunner spent the entire trip trying to convince a member of our crew that there was no danger in these missions. A few seconds after the chopper dropped us off in the open landing zone, the guerrillas opened fire. 8 slugs pierced the gunner's lungs, killing him instantly. We would be out with the Cazadores for days at a time in remote mountain areas where there were no phones or electricity. That meant we had to pack 40 to 60 pounds of gear apiece. The Cazadores were proud of their designation as the military wing of the pacification program.
We are here, the Cazadores, to serve everyone, and wherever we go, we try to serve the people. Up to now, I've been proud of this battalion. I'm proud to be a member of the Cazadores, and although we've had little experience up to now, we fought well, and I feel the battalion will be even better later on, when we get more experience. When we fight with them, we never run, and we decide to win or die, to win or die trying.
Another unique American innovation in the Cazadores program was the selection of officers from the ranks of the Army. This Salvadoran lieutenant was promoted
after 10 years as an enlisted man.
The most profound change I've seen from 1979 till now is more respect for human rights. It isn't the same army as before. No, it's something completely new.
At La Mosa Battalion Tehuacan of the Pueblo, worked his way up through the ranks, trained in Colombia, trained in Panama, trained in Fort Benning, believed in taking prisoners, which is unheard of until U.S. officers, U.S. trained officers arrived on the scene. Dedicated, duty-bound, and aggressive.
This isolated village called San Ildefonso was an early target of the pacification program. Without electrical power, a municipal water system, or access to a major highway, it had often been under guerrilla control and had been battered in the war by both sides. The town's mayor seemed glad to see the cazadores arrive.
I'm glad I've been able to help them. And as a result, we have become united. I'm glad they're here. Thanks to God, because there has been a change. Since the army's been here, the guerrillas haven't come back to our village.
The cazadores treated these civilians with great respect compared to most Salvadoran army units. This 19-year-old sergeant from San Vicente forbid his men to touch a woman on the street or to requisition even a Coca-Cola without money to pay for it. In the past, an M16 rifle had been a kind of credit card for soldiers wanting anything from a sidewalk vendor. This young sergeant studied his guerrilla counterparts.
Well, it's like this. Maybe it's because of all the experience that we've had that we have learned how they fight and what they do. In other words, we use their tactics whenever necessary.
All summer, we watched the sergeant train his troops, always smiling, always encouraging. He seemed everything a good soldier should be. His troops were willing to follow him anywhere. In November 1983, the smiling young sergeant died in a rebel ambush near San Vicente. The American advisors in San Vicente had an overwhelming task from the moment they arrived. Much of their work was instructing the civil defense units that were supposed to become the backbone of the pacification program. The civil defense is a paramilitary unit with the worst human rights record in El Salvador. They were formed years ago as a sort of army reserve. In truth, they were private militias, armed and paid by local landowners. Since they were not under the jurisdiction of the armed forces, these organizations formed the base for the first death squads. Still, the American advisors gamely provided them with the first actual military training they'd ever had. The members of this unit explained why they were in the civil defense.
I joined to defend my family and to defend my village and to defend the rest of the Salvadorians. Between the new civil defense and the old civil defense, there is a big difference. We, the older members of the civil defense, have a better knowledge of the arms and also of the terrain.
Unfortunately for the American advisors, despite their new uniforms and American-made M16s, the civil defense units usually ran at the first sign of a rebel attack. We were the only other Americans in San Vicente besides the advisors. We got to know many of them. Since most of our crew had been in Vietnam, we had a degree of mutual background, even if the ever-present barrier of our separate professions remained. Field producer John Buff had served in Vietnam with the Green Berets. One night, we sat in a restaurant with several Vietnam-era advisors. Two advisors arrived who had obviously been drinking. The two sergeants became hostile, accusing the entire press corps of being guerrilla sympathizers. The other advisors discreetly left. Without a word of warning, one of the advisors, Staff Sergeant Merle, knocked me to the floor, punching my head and shouting profanities. The altercation continued in front of the restaurant. At one point, the other American advisor, Sergeant G. Studley, unsnapped his .45 caliber pistol. It was only the swift action of a young Salvadoran lieutenant who spoke English that prevented the attack from perhaps escalating to a deadly level. We filed a complaint asking for an investigation. When the Salvadoran witnesses testified, the attack had been unprovoked and that Studley had nearly drawn his weapon. The two advisors were disciplined and sent back to the United States.
In a different dimension, the average advisor in San Vicente during Operation Bienestar drank more in a month than the soldiers made. Treated them quite badly, which was a big disappointment to me since I had been in Special Forces. But there's no understanding.
Intimidation by the armed forces is a way of life in San Vicente. For example, 90% of the people must travel by bus. Every stop means ready guns, rough searches, harsh questions, and a demand for the national ID card. No ID card, any behavior a soldier calls subversive means arrest, detention, or disappearance. Even for a well-respected family like the Panameños, the appearance of troops is terrifying.
They support the government. Why is it that they feel threatened by the government? Why do they, when they see the Guardia walking into their where they live, why do they have to be in fear, wondering if they're going to be executed by the Guardia? I don't understand that. They support the government, yet they're in constant fear that they're going to be executed or killed by somebody within the military.
At night especially, the troops personify brute force.
I remember the first time that and it happened many times thereafter, but the first time I ever experienced sitting up at the bar, at a little hole-in-the-wall bar where we used to hang out called El Tuyo, and sitting drinking a beer, talking to the lady, and all of a sudden, bang, 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 and turn around, and these guys have got a Coke bottle set up on the table, and with M16s, which is a pretty high-caliber rifle, taking shots at a Coke bottle inside this building. Well, that went on, man. That was a commonplace, I was to come to find out.
Producer Richard Boyle was sitting with the commander of the American advisors when 3 drunken soldiers began blasting away at a restaurant roof. The colonel hunched forward, shrugged his shoulders, and said, "They aren't our guys."
And we'd bring this up to the American advisors in San Vicente, and it's just basically a point of boys will be boys. It's not a whole lot we can do. We tell them not to. It was about the greatest response they had towards that.
As the months passed, our crew nicknamed San Vicente Dodge City.
When the drunk soldiers came around and a little more than just tipsy, sitting in the room, knowing I was a journalist, knowing these were Salvadoran civilians, ended up just handing me his M16. And when you're a soldier, you don't pack your weapons when you're on R&R or when you're out on leave or when you're having a good time, especially loaded with a round in the chamber.
Generally well taken that soldiers roam the streets drunk, and they intimidate people, and it's a miracle that there haven't been more deaths.
Each year, at the end of the rainy season, the guerrillas launch a new offensive. This was no exception. Members of this unit, called the Arsi Sabla Batallon, or BRAS, attacked the nation's 3rd largest city, San Miguel.
Well, what happened is very simply the 3 guerrilla brigades marched into town, blew the bridges going in and out, and pinned the government troops down in the quartel, and held the town from about midnight to dawn, and then left, and came out with very little casualties. Press coverage of this was virtually nil because reporters got there after the fact. It's very hard to get to battles, unless you go out with the government forces, and they don't want to get you in if they get their asses kicked. I mean, they only want to show you their victories. And if you're lucky enough to be with the G's on this guerrillas on this kind of operation, it's just luck. And so that's why there's very little good combat footage coming out, good combat stuff coming out.
This group of some 40 rebels, 10 of them women, had blown a bridge in San Miguel. Peasants were feeding them just outside the town. They carried weapons they'd captured from the army. Some of them were only 12 years old, but they had all been fighting for 2 to 5 years. Field producer John Buff, who fought against rebels in both Vietnam and Rhodesia, recalls his impressions of the young fighters.
Unique. They are the best guerrilla forces fielded in the 20th century, in my opinion. After having served in Vietnam and Rhodesia, I think I have some idea of what good guerrilla forces are. They are far better than the Viet Cong were, who were considered unique at that time by us. Their mean age is 17 or so. The people that lead them have been in the mountains for years.
The awesome effects of U.S.-supplied air power were put on display a few days later when Secretary of Defense Cap Weinberger visited San Vicente, accompanied by the U.S. ambassador and the head of the Salvadoran Armed Forces, Colonel Vidas Casanova. Weinberger left little doubt of the Reagan administration's determination to expand the military effort in Central America.
Well, I think that it's quite clear that the government troops have had increasing success in the last few months. The leadership and the morale and the training has improved. I think the training that we're going to see in Honduras will be very helpful. And I think that they're bringing increasing amounts of the country under general control and enabling civilian rule to be reestablished. And that's a very good tendency. What I worry about is whether or not the support will run out before that mission can be accomplished.
Weinberger told reporters the rebels were being supplied by the Soviet Union through Nicaragua and Cuba.
Progress has been made, but guerrilla warfare is difficult, and it does take a lot of support. And it's quite clear that the support amounts that we asked originally in the United States are fully justified. Depends on the rates of consumption and things of that kind, but it would, I think, go a long way toward making the government forces convinced that they had a regular resupply effort. The guerrilla forces do have through Nicaragua and Cuba and the Soviet Union.
But the CIA analyst actually in charge of monitoring that supposed weapons flow, David McMichael, says there was never any hard evidence to support Weinberger's charges.
The whole CIA effort was all going to incriminate Nicaragua, and nothing was being done to provide an actual analysis of where these weapons were coming from. They said, wait a minute, you're talking about, starting this effort ostensibly to interdict an arms flow, which A, I don't think is coming from Nicaragua, and B, where's the analysis? There's some very simple questions that you ask about, where? First of all, where are the sources from which it comes? What routes are being used, qualitative and quantitatively? What types of arms are there? What means are used for distributing them? What is, describe the storage and distribution systems? All it just didn't square with the picture that they're trying to present. It's just nothing to do with reality on the ground. It has everything to do with political realities in Washington and elsewhere.
And the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Norm Mineta, says the CIA was never able to show his committee any proof either.
As the CIA would come before the committee, I would keep repeating this one question, and that was, show me that one round of ammunition or that 1 pound of high explosives that you have interdicted during this operation. And to this day, we haven't seen it. And so naturally, to me, their true colors have shown for a long time.
As often happens on political junkets, a number of such incongruities are never closely examined by a press corps that must fly or drive in to such a location for but a few hours. What Weinberger's trip did establish was the basis for escalating the air war being fought against the guerrillas and their civilian supporters. In neighboring Honduras, U.S. instructors and trainers were setting up the logistics to support the expanding air war and for the training of Honduran and Salvadoran troops.
We've been basically getting set up and so forth and basically combined arms with the Army, Navy, and Air Force so far. We've had some dealings with the Hondurans as far as the base camp where we're stationed, but we haven't really trained in our area yet.
Over the next year, we would see the devastating results of the U.S.-directed air war on the entire civilian population of San Vicente. The widening of the Pan American Highway was one of the many pacification program projects that the Reagan administration tried to use to stimulate the ailing economy of San Vicente. But we found widespread corruption among the military officers administering the program. Clearly marked food supplies, labeled a gift to the American people, were on sale throughout the marketplace. Several soldiers told us that this truckload of food was going back to San Salvador, not to the nearby refugee camp. When U.S. officials finally demanded a crackdown, it was only the poverty-stricken women selling the goods in the marketplace in San Vicente were charged. Along with the pacification program, the Reagan administration hoped that elections would lend credibility to the government, and their candidate of choice was former junta president José Napoleón Duarte. Prior to the recent shooting of 4 American Marines in San Salvador, only 1 American advisor had died in El Salvador over the course of the 5-year war. Lieutenant Commander Albert Schaffelberger was slain by an urban guerrilla group. Schaffelberger's death touched off a series of incidents that directly involved our crew. The rebel radio station accused the Hacienda police of torturing a false confession to Schaffelberger's murder out of a captured guerrilla. The rebels admitted they killed Schaffelberger, but insisted the prisoner was not the killer. AP reporter Arthur Allen filed a report on the rebel claim. That report angered the Hacienda police.
Well, he was visited by the Hacienda police and told in uncertain terms that his life was in danger if he stayed in the country. And the embassy advised him to leave. The situation got so bad that the SPCA, the press association down there, gave a warning to all press. If you got any notification from the Hacienda police come and talk to them, don't do it, because you may just vanish.
One morning, a phone call came to CBS, I believe it was, where we had some friends, and I believe the caller identified himself as with the Hacienda police and wanted to know if Don Gomez worked for CBS or PBS. And the guy that was on the phone had only been in country about a week and was just hearing all these monster stories. And he said, I don't know, and hung up. And it shook him real bad. And naturally, that got to us. Well, that was bad. That made us a little nervous, the fact that the Hacienda police had taken an interest in our activities.
Well, I was told personally by Colonel Stankovich, the commander of the Special Forces group in San Vicente, that they were discussing at the mess hall of Salvadoran military officers how to kill us. I mean, how to get a scenario where we could be operating allegedly with the guerrillas and we'd be caught in a firefight as 4 Dutch journalists were 2 years before. And he said, my advice to you is to get out because you're on their list.
And things at the Ramada Inn went from bad to worse.
We called Don Hamilton, who was one of the embassy officials there, U.S. embassy officials in San Salvador. And he came to the Ramada Inn and met with us and very frankly told us of how Arthur was not only suggested, recommended to leave the country, and they put him up in Hamilton's house even, and that these threats that were coming down from the Hacienda police were indeed very real and something that they were taking extremely seriously, and wholeheartedly endorsed the suggestion that Don and Richard both leave. Cherokee was sort of escorting us and following us as we got in and out, and one night, as we were parked our vehicle and were making our way into the Ramada Inn, a Cherokee came by at a very slow speed, and somebody leaned out, and it seemed to me somebody was on a bullhorn even. And, you know, everybody, there were about 4 of us, and just without even thinking, everybody just hit the ground. Thought that was it. Well, were some, you know, goons that were staying in the Ramada Inn, some guys with you know, all the markings of military personnel, but looked to me like they were packing guns, and these guys followed us right out to the parking lot. You guys going to a combat? Can we come? Can we come? They wanted to come with us, you know. And we at that point decided that Don and Richard both should go back to country and just sort of let things cool out.
Meanwhile, the coffee crop was ready up on the volcano. So those members of the crew the American embassy felt were in no danger remained to film the harvest. Lauri, the Panameño's widowed daughter, went to work harvesting coffee to earn money for her 2 young sons. For about 10 cents an hour, Lauri and these women worked from 4 a.m. to almost 6 p.m. They picked the coffee, bag it, carry it to the scales, then load it on a truck. Despite much talk of land reform in El Salvador, Lauri and these campesinos were still working for the same wages as when she was a child. They laughed openly at the idea of the situation ever changing. Despite a massive military presence by the Salvadoran government, the volcano was openly conceded to be guerrilla territory. Our crew encountered many of the young guerrillas in the outlying areas of San Vicente. Often only 12 or 13 years old, they looked like they should be at Girl or Boy Scout outings instead of packing M16s. Their nickname among the campesinos is Los Muchachos, the youngsters. As Christmas approached, San Vicente did its best to celebrate the birth of the nation's patron saint El Salvador del Mundo, the Savior of the world, Jesus Christ. Unlike the Americanized version of San Salvador's commercial district, people in San Vicente struggle to maintain the sincerity and simple joy of the Christmas message. Amidst the war, it was an act of overwhelming faith.
The thing that really stuck in my mind most was, here I am, God knows how many thousands of miles away from my own family, yet I still feel like I'm in a family, but so different. No Christmas tree there. The one thing that vividly sticks in my mind is the Panameño's Christmas tree was basically a drawing on the wall in the TV room of a tree with confetti and stuff on it to decorate it. And God, it worked just as well as any tree I'd ever used. And the kids sure loved it.
The American colonel in charge of the troops at San Vicente told our crew there was far more coordination among the guerrilla groups than he had seen in the past. Still another American advisor, a member of the Navy SEAL team charged with preventing arms from entering El Salvador from Nicaragua, told us, "I've been here since June of '82. There ain't been a gun come in here from Nicaragua since then. But these bastards are running a scam. I'm glad I'm getting out." When I failed to return home one evening, Milt Graham called the American embassy to seek help finding me. The embassy sent over a U.S. military advisor who told Graham the embassy had told him. Well, Don had a lot of guerrilla connections. As Graham was giving the officer my vital statistics, I walked into the room. The only feeling such incidents offer is a sense of relief. The guns of war were silent as Christmas approached, and both sides took a break from the horrors of the situation. But gunfire as well as fireworks welcomed the new year as the rebels launched a daring attack against a large government fort called El Paraíso, the Paradise. Its bittersweet name brought the Panameños terrible news. Their son, Ugi, a lieutenant trained in the United States, had been killed in the attack. Ugi was a gentle soul with little love for the life of a soldier, but he told us that a commission was the only road open to an education. His funeral allowance was tied up in bureaucratic bungling because many of the dead at El Paraíso had been buried by the government in a mass grave. The family had no money for a funeral. Among our crew, we managed to come up with the money for Ugi's funeral. It was one of the saddest events we would ever film. Following the attack at El Paraíso, the guerrillas struck again, blowing up the largest bridge in El Salvador, El Puente Cuscatlán, near San Vicente. In the face of the back-to-back attacks and huge government losses, the Panameños learned that their son Edgar had decided to flee the country and seek refuge in the United States. For the Panameños, it was a difficult choice at best. It is also why we have never shown Edgar on camera. He is still in the United States illegally. If he is caught and sent back to El Salvador, he will face certain death.
They sent Edgar north because they realized how futile it was to keep him in El Salvador to fight for people who have absolutely no concern of human rights and to fight for a country that has an incredible repression of democracy, that there was no reason for him to lose his life that way.
The effective loss of two sons left the family with a deep void, but it also brought our crew further into their family circle.
Feel like I even became part of the family just through all the time we spent together. And a big part of what we used to do in our idle time, I was at that time a real serious and energetic student of Spanish. I was doing pretty well with just standard Spanish, but I wanted to get to know the colloquialisms or the local slang. It's one thing to be able to say, may I go to the bathroom? It's another thing to say, where's the can? You got to speak a little more in the way they talk. And the mother of the family, Araceli, just loved to teach me their slang. They call it caliche. And she used to get the biggest kick out of sitting me down and teaching me things I don't know what, even the equivalent in, right on, man, where you going, dude? The equivalent of that in Spanish, like, hola, calzón, ¿dónde vas? And for me to get up in the morning and greet her with a, hola, calzón, tuanis, she would get the biggest laugh and smile, and it was for both of us the greatest pleasure.
Chepe, the family's third son, returned to San Vicente and took over running the small pension. The increased guerrilla activity around San Vicente served to further demoralize the young cazadores, who after a promising start were now suffering increasing losses in the countryside.
The people that grew up on the side of a mountain, 15, 16, 17 years old, impressed in the military service, scared, away from home, know that they're going up against better troops in battle, do not learn well, and suffer horrendous casualties for it.
The military state of the war was the key election issue for the right-wing candidate, former Major Roberto D'Aubuisson. D'Aubuisson has been closely linked to death squad activity. He was cashiered out of the armed forces for such activity. Allegations against D'Aubuisson include planning the murder of Archbishop Oscar Romero and attacks against the American embassy. His party's campaign was a lavish one that included almost constant airplay of a catchy theme song that promised to bury the guerrillas in the mountains. For D'Aubuisson, the Christian Democrats and the foreign press are all communist agents.
Because Christian Democrats don't want the 25th of March to rise. They don't want elections. Because for the past 4 years, they've been crying to all the little whiteys of the foreign press that they were the ones, they would save the country. And for 4 years, they've been wrong, saying that crazy Duarte and the Christian Democrats are what the people want. And this is a lie.
San Vicente is a traditional stronghold for the Green and White Party of the Christian Democratic candidate, José Napoleon Duarte. Duarte gamely fought back. He was no stranger to the military intrigues of El Salvador. In 1972, he was tortured and exiled by the army after being elected president in a free and fair election.
I'm going to govern. And I'm going to govern in accord with the Constitution of this country. And the Constitution is clear in the powers that it signifies for the President of this Republic. Because of the Constitution, after the 1st of June, no one can restrict me, nor the powers of the Constitution, from exercising the duties of the President of this Republic.
Each year, as the elections approached, the guerrillas launched a stepped-up assault in order to prevent their own cause from being snowed under by the avalanche of North American press coverage surrounding the elections. The election assaults have proved costly to the press as well. 4 Dutch journalists and a Chilean died in 1982.
You have to work both sides if you're trying to do an honest reporting job, but there's a great deal of risk. And the risk is, like the Dutch guys, if they find you with the guerrillas, it's carte blanche to shoot you in the head. They were shot allegedly in a firefight, but the autopsy performed by the Dutch showed they had powder burns at close range, so they were definitely executed. So if you operate with the guerrillas and are captured, it's a death sentence right then and there. And you know those ground rules going out with them.
This time it was the Dean of North American Still Photographers in El Salvador, John Hoagland, who paid the ultimate price. He was cut down during a gun battle near the town of Suchitoto. Most of our crew had known and worked with John since he arrived in El Salvador in 1980. Because he traveled frequently with guerrilla groups in order to show both sides, his name appeared on death lists of journalists to be killed by the right wing. John refused to leave or be intimidated by the threats, but he also knew they were very real. No formal charges have ever been filed in the death of John Hoagland, but many who knew him wonder if the full story of his death will ever come out.
I think what really happened was he was always so much on top of everything that was going on there. I can't help but feel that when he went out there in the middle of a firefight, that's when it's anybody's game. And I think it's quite possible that he there might have been some sergeant or somebody there said, well, Larry, here he comes again. Let's get him now. Because there's going to be no way anybody's going to know. It's a heavy fighting, crossfire situation. And I think, so I don't mean I don't think he was necessarily set up, but I can understand how it's quite possible that somebody made a decision on their own. They didn't need any orders from higher up to do it.
There are many reasons why it is difficult to gather evidence in the deaths of the 12 Western reporters who have died under similar circumstances.
It was, people were so quiet about the way the thing was. And maybe it's because the people I talked to were right there, right under fire, when the same thing happened. And maybe it's because it was really hard for them to imagine that they may have come that close to being killed themselves, that somebody finally just said, we're going to dust this guy.
3 days after Hoagland died, the owner of the Ramada Inn in San Salvador, Federico Cruz, showed me a list of journalists on official stationery of the Arena right-wing party. John Hoagland's name was on the list. So was my own. Back in San Vicente, the elections got underway on March 23rd with long lines and considerable confusion. It had been 12 years since Salvador had a legitimate presidential election. But on the outskirts of San Vicente, the guerrillas ambushed a patrol of cazadores. 33 died in the ambush, and the relief column sent in suffered 17 more casualties. 50 soldiers, almost all of them from San Vicente, had died in the ambush. As word of the battle spread, anxious families began to gather in front of the military hospital. Virtually everyone in the small town had a friend or relative who died in the battle. This young lieutenant who lived on our street was among the casualties, as were several young cazadores who we had traveled with. There were wakes or velorios all night. Then came the huge military funeral.
They had died, and for what? The people, the mothers were wailing and fainting and crying and screaming, and I never saw anything like it. It was absolutely horrible. Mothers fainted on top of gravestones, literally, one right after the other, and it affected me very deeply. I couldn't take pictures for a while. It was so bad. And then after I got through with a son being buried, I would go to the next one, and this was just so horrible because it was all starting all over again. They were looking at their son for the last time through a trap door in the casket, and then the mother some of them would be on top of the casket screaming. Then they'd lower it and throw dirt. Then I'd go to the next one and 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 the next one, forever and ever and ever, and it was just absolutely horrible.
For the people of San Vicente, especially those who lost loved ones, it was the end of any illusion about Operation Well-Being. Their sons had been trained by the North Americans who had given them the best of weapons and equipment. The gringos had poured millions of dollars into San Vicente to pacify the area. And less than a year later, but a mile from their own fort, the troops had been cut to ribbons by the guerrillas. It was announced that Duarte and D'Aubuisson would meet in a runoff election, but it was an anticlimax. For the people in San Vicente knew that there would be no real change until the muchachos, the kids with the guns, were reckoned with. The guerrillas next hit a small town near San Vicente called Guadalupe. They blew up the local phone company, the town hall, and knocked out electrical power in several nearby villages. In Guadalupe, we discovered further evidence of U.S. food supplies being sold at a profit instead of distributed to the residents. A poor town, even by Salvadoran standards, the people said they had not seen any aid given away for a long time, that it was common knowledge that the food could be bought. A large pig wandered into the mayor's office where the food and grain were hidden, and he began eating out of a package labeled a gift of the American people. The peasants laughed and called it appropriate. The army managed to retake the town the next day, but during the fight, 2 members of the Green Cross, the Salvadoran version of the Red Cross, were killed while trying to aid the wounded. We knew both of the young volunteer paramedics from San Vicente. They had been killed by rebel gunfire as they came around a sharp turn approaching Guadalupe. Their funeral attracted national attention because the armed forces denounced the act as rebel terrorism. The rebels issued a formal apology to both the Green Cross and the International Red Cross. But once again, it was the young of San Vicente who paid the price. The town of Sociedad, near San Vicente, was one of a growing number of villages where the rebels sought to establish a permanent presence. In most aspects, Sociedad resembled any of hundreds of such towns, business and work going on as usual, except for the total absence of the armed forces. The town jail was deserted, as were most of the other government buildings. Graffiti by the town's children covered the walls and revealed their experiences with the reality of the war, especially the escalating air war. The town's peasants told us there were no problems in the town except when the armed forces returned.
Yes, it's almost always quiet. Except when the 3rd Battalion returns to destroy homes and terrorize the people.
Most members of our crew shared the peasants' view that the presence of the armed forces often provoked more violence than it prevented.
Actually, I heard stories of how it was before the guerrillas came, and I don't particularly like to be a proponent of any particular viewpoint or anything. I mean, I feel I try to be an objective observer when I'm there, but this is just all I heard was that, now the school's open. Before it never used to be open, and now there's not a whole lot of, now, when the army was there was a lot of combat going on, probably because the guerrillas were launching attacks on it. But once the army left and let the guerrillas be in charge of that area as it was, the town was tranquil, and the people were certainly much more content and happier.
The guerrillas that I seen were of the people, of the Pueblo, were always fed, were treated well by civilians, and in turn treated the civilians well. Never any implication of threat or anything like that. And my presence was not a factor in that. It was a natural thing. In the one case, at a roadblock, people were throwing more money out the window of the bus and food and stuff like that to the guerrillas than they could use.
The armed forces were stationed at a nearby town called Jocoro. It was a large garrison with a permanent presence of more than 500 troops, a vivid contrast to Sociedad. In Jocoro, we were arrested by soldiers who took us to the commanding officer. After checking our military credentials, we were released. The officer told us journalists should not be allowed to visit rebel areas of the country. From Jocoro, we drove back to San Vicente, where we learned that our sound man, a local resident named Luis Mena, was reputed to be involved with death squad activity. Because such charges are so common in San Vicente, we didn't pay much attention to them. But the next night, the lieutenant in charge of the National Guard post invited me for drinks at his office. And while U.S.-trained soldiers waited on us and went out for drinks and ice, the lieutenant confirmed that Mena was known to have been involved in such activity. The lieutenant told me to speak to the former commander of the National Guard in San Vicente, Don Foncho. A dignified older gentleman with a white mustache, Don Foncho told me that Mena and a gang of common thieves, disguised as guerrillas, had often assaulted buses on the Pan American Highway. A schoolteacher of Mena's had recognized him despite his bandana. She had gone to Don Foncho to file a complaint, but because of a lifelong friendship with Mena's father, he had let him off with a warning. Don Foncho said it was a sad case because he had heard since then that Mena was involved with a gang of right-wing thugs who had assaulted numerous Christian Democrats. The accusations against Mena might never stand up in a U.S. court of law, much less in El Salvador. but they were another vivid example of the climate of violence in San Vicente. The U.S.-directed air war continues to escalate throughout San Vicente. During a guerrilla attack in April of 1984, the government called in the first in a continuing series of airstrikes directed against its own civilian population. Here in San Sebastián, the civil defense troops broke ranks and ran in the face of a guerrilla assault. The army responded by battering the town with heavy artillery gun placements located on the outskirts of San Vicente. When that failed to dislodge the guerrillas, the Air Force made a number of strikes in the heart of the city. One guerrilla died after capturing this sentry station, but they managed to withdraw without further losses. The airstrikes took a heavy toll on the civilian population of San Sebastián. Many who died were bombed while huddling in their own homes. This was the first of many funerals the small town was to hold for victims of the bombing raids. The people in the town seem at a loss to explain the indiscriminate bombing by their own government.
I don't know how I explain. The trouble is that they haven't too many shots. Say somebody that many people have trouble with the dent, you know. That's all.
The government airstrikes were becoming a part of daily life in and around San Vicente. The area that was hardest hit was the San Pedro mountain range, a long-time guerrilla stronghold. The area is part of a growing pattern of establishing what are known as free fire zones, where virtually any living thing becomes a target. We decided to visit the guerrilla zone to assess the impact of the growing air war. We edged our Volkswagen down a narrow trail leading into the mountains. Suddenly, a National Guardsman in a chrome helmet stuck a G3 rifle in my face. Our van was surrounded by National Guardsmen and a lieutenant who ordered us arrested and taken to guard headquarters in San Sebastián. On the trip back, the lieutenant was alternately screaming profanities and threatening to shoot us all on the spot. The lieutenant called military headquarters in San Vicente, saying he'd captured a group of guerrilla journalists. The 5th Brigade commander, Colonel Chepe Murcia, knew us from our travels with the Cazadores. He told the lieutenant, as long as our credentials were in order, we were free to travel anywhere in San Vicente. Furious but powerless to stop us, the lieutenant released us. We decided to walk the 30 kilometers to the guerrilla zone.
De un pueblo que lucha, será el que nos guía a la victoria final, hermanos unidos para combatir.
Life here at the guerrilla's regional headquarters begins at 5 a.m. with the singing of their own national anthem.
Patria libre, o morir, patria muerta, ante la intervención imperialista, los fusiles comunistas.
Then come the preparations for the day's activities, including all the logistics of feeding several hundred fighters who will come in and out of the camp during the course of a single day. The work is divided among men and women, with the men often assuming stereotypical women's work, such as the grinding of corn for tortillas. At this camp, there were members of 3 separate guerrilla organizations, the FAL, the ERP, and the FPL. The groups have banded together, along with 2 other guerrilla groups, in the Frente Farabundo Martí para Liberación Nacional, known simply as the FMLN. Virtually all activity at the camp is directed towards supporting the fighters who will come and go from the camp on maneuvers and patrols that often take them as far as 100 kilometers in a couple of days. The rebels maintain constant radio contact with other camps clustered throughout the mountain range. This young radio operator was using a 2-way that had been purchased at a Radio Shack store in San Salvador. Since there is no electrical power in any part of this area, the rebels use batteries that they wear in a pouch or on their belts. the vast majority of weapons that we saw in these camps, and those carried by the guerrillas in the entire region of San Vicente. They were mostly U.S.-made M16 and AR-15 rifles, such as these, that all bore dates of manufacture since 1980. We made frequent checks of weapons and failed to find any Soviet bloc arms.
Like this one, you know, they made this one in June of '83, you know. This is the number of the equipment that they put on. You just got this. And the bags too, everything.
The guerrillas also displayed an acute awareness of what was good soldiering.
They all believed, and seemed to me, believed in what they were doing. It wasn't just that they were on the other side. It wasn't just a survival trip. I mean, definitely into what they were doing. Good discipline. They knew their weapons that they had captured. I mean, I'd lived with 16s for a year in Vietnam, and watching them field strip them, you know, even down to the trigger housing, which I never even bothered with. They knew how to keep care of their captured weapons really well.
The civilians in these mountains support the guerrillas because they seem to see them as their only hope for a better life. There are civilians who come to the camp on a regular basis to sell the guerrillas everything from pan dulce, or sweet bread, to cigarettes. The guerrillas do not seem to mind that the people who came to sell them goods charge them more than the same goods would cost in town. As one commander put it, they have to make a living. This area has been so hard hit by the air war that not a single house has a complete roof over it in this area. They have all been hit, and the civilians and guerrillas alike make no attempt to fix the roofs because they say it would only attract the attention of the U.S. planes when they come seeking new targets. The air raid shelters they have fashioned are often nothing more than holes dug into the roadside. These children quickly responded to a request that they hop into this shelter, just as they do when the planes are bombing or strafing their homes. Much of the ground here, the vegetation, even the trees, have been scorched by fires that resulted from phosphorus flares, bombs, or the push and pull rockets supplied by the A-37 Dragonfly planes.
You know, the aviation, you know, the Army, you know, the Air Force. Yeah, what they're doing now is killing, you know, civilian people, you know. They're killing a lot of campesinos. I really feel sorry about that, you know, because all the most people that I see here is campesinos. They don't have a weapon, and they died, you know.
Many of the civilians that live in the San Pedro mountain range have sons or daughters fighting with the guerrilla forces. This woman has 3 sons fighting with the guerrillas. She has only seen one of them over the past 3 years since she's been living here. She describes how a group of rebels saved her and a group of women from being shot by an army patrol.
Well, they want to kill everyone.
Here,
the life for us is very hard. We can barely get enough to eat. If you can imagine it, in our zone, they, the Army, had us all lined up to kill us. 8 of us, 8 old women like me. They were going to kill us. When these youngsters that you brought here, they appeared, and they told the soldiers, "What are you doing? One must respect women." Then they, the guerrillas, told us to go into our houses. We stayed inside until the battle was over. Then they brought us here. If we had stayed, the Army would have killed us.
Like most everyone here, she fears the bombing raids the most. She describes what goes through her mind during a typical raid.
Oh, God, what we hope is to live through it, to survive the bomb, and we beg God to bring us through it alive.
When they had some spare time, the guerrillas were fascinated to talk to us about North American impressions of the war. and they have a remarkable ability to distinguish the difference between the policies of the U.S. government and the North American people.
Because, you know, I've been in the States and I know the people, there is a lot of American people who really like us, you know. They really understand what is our fight against, you know. And they know that we have the reason here, you know.
Perhaps of all the things that perplex them about how the war is viewed in the United States, the idea that their revolution is being supplied or stage managed by Cubans, Russians, or Nicaraguans is the most baffling.
I never meet one of them. You know, I think the only Cubans that I meet is in the States, you know. The first time when I came to Acampamento, I was expecting, you know, to meet some Cuban people, but I still, you know, trying to meet one of them here.
How long have you been fighting?
6 years now.
And you never seen a Cuban or a Nicaraguan?
No, I don't. They don't come here.
Probably nothing any member of our crew said to the guerrillas drew more howls of laughter than our own impressions regarding the seemingly phantom communist advisors.
And none of them were Cuban. So we became convinced that there was a Cuban. There had to be a Cuban, but he was a magic Cuban that had an ability to appear as if he was 10 to 15% of those that were captured, and he could magically escape and reappear time and time again, because every other day the magic Cuban was recaptured and admitted to the fact that he was trained in Cuba, and it's just, like I said, no relation to reality whatsoever. And I mean,
the magic Cuban they keep talking about is alleged James Bond, the KGB, who's Cuban, who's a mastermind of the guerrilla victories, because no Salvadoran could be smart enough to keep beating the Salvadoran army. The magic Cuban they keep promising to produce, they never do. They always find dead bodies, and we go up and look at the dead body. It's not the magic Cuban, and I apologize. They're going to get them next week.
There is no case when I saw anybody that was Russian, Cuban, Ethiopian, or anybody else. They simply do not exist. Even though there are awful stories told by the Defense Intelligence Agency, U.S. Embassy, and State about Vietnamese, Cuban, Nicaraguan, and it goes on. In many cases, journalists in El Salvador simply refer to them as the magic Cubans. There have been literally companies of Cubans killed, according to the Defense Intelligence Agency. However, nobody has ever been recorded.
The guerrilla's most chronic shortage was in the area of medical treatment for both fighters and civilians. These two men had been wounded in a firefight with a National Guardsman. They were being transported by the only form of medevac the guerrillas possess, litter bearers. Jorge is a comandante and medic who has lived in the United States. He says their only medical supplies must come from what they can capture.
Well, you know, we need a lot of things, but we're getting now a lot of equipment, medical equipment and medicine from the army, from the ejército here.
That you're capturing from the military?
Yes. Like, you know, the last time we got some good equipment, you know, good books, good bags, and a few days ago we really get a good quantity of medicine and military equipment for medical things.
We left the guerrilla camp after a meeting with 3 ranking comandantes from the various rebel groups. They did not wish to be interviewed on camera for fear that our film might be confiscated. And they warned us that we would be in a great deal of danger if we were detained by the military after leaving an area of guerrilla control. As we started back on a long walk to San Sebastian, we received another chilling piece of news. The road that we had come in on was mined.
Vamos a pasar aquí. Vamos aquí, pero aquí va a haber que vadir por ahí nomás.
Vamos pues.
Hay que ir poniendo el pie en el medio, lo voy a poner.
Our guerrilla guide led us around and through the mines along the trail. Then we started the long hike, and a half day later, in the late afternoon, arrived in San Sebastian. As we approached our van, we were confronted by members of the National Guard. After questioning us as to where we had been, they took us to Lieutenant Rodriguez. The lieutenant again called to the 5th Brigade headquarters. Since we had been given permission by the commanding officer, we expected no problems. The lieutenant angrily ordered us into our van, and accompanied by a group of armed soldiers, we were taken to the 5th Brigade headquarters in San Vicente. On the ride to San Vicente, the soldiers joked that we would be sleeping in a ditch that night, and that we were going to be separated from our heads. At the fort, the 5th Brigade's executive officer, Colonel Adrian Ticas, demanded to see our footage. When we refused, he accused us of being communist subversives. He shook my hand at one point, congratulating us on our work on behalf of the rebels. We explained we were neutrals and couldn't allow either side to view our work. The colonel arrested us and confiscated our cameras and equipment. We asked Ticas to allow us to speak to Colonel Murcia, the commanding officer. He was not at the fort. We asked to talk to the military press command or the American embassy, and Ticas refused. The colonel told us we were being deported to Guatemala. We were loaded into a van at gunpoint. A soldier kept us covered with an M16, and a civilian driver with a .45 pistol in his belt drove out of the fort. 2 truckloads of soldiers accompanied us. Instead of heading north towards Guatemala, we were driven down a lightly traveled road called the Litoral. After a few minutes, our van and the 2 truckloads of soldiers pulled onto a deserted road and stopped alongside a large ditch. It was nearly sundown. There was no one else around. The civilian driver got out and began passing a bottle of cane alcohol among the troops. The driver said he wanted to kill the pinche Mexicano and the guanaco, vulgar references to me and to our Salvadoran sound man. The soldiers had unslung their weapons and surrounded the van. Drinking and laughing, they joked of dumping our bodies in the nearby ditch. A young soldier I recognized from San Vicente came to the window of the van. He said, "This is wrong. They're going to kill you because my colonel says you're communist subversives." Cameraman Ken Gomez recalls his thoughts as we sat in the back of the van.
When he sent us out on the road in our bus with the civilian gunzel and the pickup truck with 15 soldiers in the van behind us with another 15 soldiers, I figured it was just going to be Hogan style. That they were going to get us out in the middle of nowhere and set up a fake crossfire and just dust us in the bus.
The lieutenant in charge told us Colonel Ticas had ordered him to eliminate us because we were subversives. The lieutenant remembered us from our travels with the 5th Brigade. Said he didn't believe we were truly subversives. We told him we were not on anyone's side, but couldn't allow our film to be used by the government or the rebels. Photographer Milt Graham remembers those frightening moments.
When the car stopped, that is when I felt that this is it, and we started to pray. It was so surreal. When the car stopped, that was it. I was, although I'd held out hope, I was sure that we were going to be executed.
The civilian driver was yelling at the lieutenant to get on with it, to eliminate them. The lieutenant walked away and spoke to several soldiers. When he returned, he told us that none of the troops in San Vicente liked Colonel Ticas. So he was going to take us to military headquarters in San Salvador until Colonel Murcia returned to San Vicente. At the Estado Mayor, the military headquarters, we were placed under guard and left sitting. Our cameras, videotapes, and equipment disappeared. We sat for hours.
Yeah, it was a long ride. It was, I've been in a lot of tight situations, especially in Vietnam, you know, fighting. And carrying that camera is, it's a whole different ball game. You're looking down the barrel of a lot of guns on both sides. And you really don't have any way of defending yourself except for, you know, you're doing your job, quote unquote, but that's no shield. Not there.
The American Vice Consul in San Salvador, Kathleen Bauman, finally appeared with the Salvadoran Army lieutenant. We learned that under the direction of an American military officer, Major Casey Walpole, our videotapes were being copied and that all the film confiscated would be developed and then returned to us. We again protested the confiscation of our materials, but Vice Consul Bauman told us we were very lucky that we had not been shot. She said, of course, that's just the way they do it. John Hoagland was not so lucky, she said. formal apology from the military high command was issued to us. The apology called the incident an unfortunate misunderstanding. In 2 days, our videotapes were returned to us, but photographer Milt Graham was unable to get back either his negatives or photos.
Yes, I spent perhaps 2 weeks trying to coordinate something between Estado Mayor and the U.S. Embassy, and basically I went on wild goose chases during the whole time. I did my best. I worked with the Vice Consul, Kathleen Barnum, who said that she would assist me, but basically did nothing in trying to get my film back, and she didn't seem to care. I feel very bitter about it, but it's normal that journalists' film should be confiscated in El Salvador.
We were all struck with the terrible irony of photographs taken by President Reagan's former personal photographer now being used against civilians in this bitter war.
I thought perhaps if I talked to someone in the White House, they might be able to help me. Instead, I got a call back, and I was informed that the White House number that I remember for years, that was the one I called, was I was told it was disconnected. So I never was able to get through.
Do you believe the number was disconnected, or do you think that your call was turned down by someone at the White House?
Well, the number has been the same for years and years. I don't want to speculate exactly who it was that did that, but I'm sure someone in the White House decided that they would solve the problem by cutting me off.
The footage the Salvadoran military confiscated from us subsequently turned up in this 1985 government propaganda film, shown on all the Salvadoran television stations. The Salvadoran government neither paid us nor acknowledged our involuntary gift to their war effort. Our footage appeared in an absurd context purporting to show Cuban advisors training rebel fighters. Thanks in part to our footage, the magic Cuban is alive and well in El Salvador.
Training and weapons were all totally provided by Cuba.
We returned to San Vicente with time enough to cover the growing hostility developing between the right-wing Arena Party and the Christian Democratic Party as the presidential election grew near. One night, a group of Christian Democrats were putting up the green and white banners of their party when a truckload of Arena backers pulled up. The Arena backers had a bullhorn aboard the truck and began threatening the Christian Democrats. The Arena members also were carrying a number of guns. They got off the truck and a few fistfights erupted. The government soldiers posted on each corner did nothing to stop the red, white, and blue party members from bullying the Duarte partisans. Duarte managed to win the election by a narrow margin, one that was tarnished by accusations that the CIA had given over $1 million to his campaign. U.S. Ambassador Thomas Pickering denied those charges, but CIA documents later verified the help Duarte had received. Right-wing candidate Roberto Dabison also lashed out at the role the CIA had played in the election. Duarte was sworn in at the nation's capital in a soccer stadium before crowds of thousands who saw his presidency as a fragile chance for democracy to take seed in El Salvador. Duarte told the crowd and a national televised audience that he would seek to bring the leftist opposition into the process of democratizing El Salvador. But he also leveled harsh criticism at their refusal to take part in the elections.
The truth is that they've fallen under the imperialism and the influence of guerrilla commanders. And up to now, they have not shown themselves to be leaders of the subversive movement.
Those views were not shared by the guerrilla fighters in the hills.
Duarte is kind of people who play chess, you know. He's taking advantage, you know. He wanted the good things for him, you know. He's a political man, and that's all, you know, but...
President Duarte was able to limit the kind of rampages by the armed forces that made scenes like these so common in San Vicente. But his progress was severely limited by the very makeup of the armed forces high command. Many of them don't trust him, and the reverse is equally true. Field producer John Buff offers a chilling assessment of the chances that Duarte can ever eliminate the death squads.
In many cases, death squad personnel are Army officers and NCOs. They operate in the areas that the Army commands, with the knowledge. If not that, the Army helps cover up some of their activities, and barring that, they ignore it, and therefore are guilty by association.
As the pacification program celebrated its first anniversary, it was obvious how far the American-sponsored program had to go in making any real improvements in the day-to-day life of people in San Vicente. There had been a great deal of rhetoric regarding improving health conditions, but most people still got their water from this polluted river. Outhouses that drained into the river were located just a few yards above it, and not a single new well had been dug in San Vicente in a year's time. Life for the Panameños after a year was still hard at best, but they always found ways to share the warmth of their family with our crew. On my birthday, they surprised me with a party and a homemade cake. For all our crew, the most enduring aspect of our stay in San Vicente was the bond of friendship with the Panameño family.
It was just an osmosis of love that we had for each other, that we really did care for each other and would do anything, regardless of any personal injury to ourselves. We would always, first was the safety that we take care of each other, because that's all we had.
There was further reason to celebrate in the Panameño home a few days later, when their daughter Lauri was married to a paramedic named Juarez, who legally adopted her two young sons, Kiki and Amilcar. But the family's joy was once again to be short-lived. Their own son, Chepe, a member of the civil defense, murdered Juarez in a drunken rage after accusing him of being a communist for having treated wounded guerrillas.
Juarez was a great guy. He was very, very close to his wife and to all the Panameños. He was always worried about other people. He was always willing to give. He was in that way, I think he was probably the strongest, that he was always willing to give to other people and to care. He was a medic. He had served in that way. He was the most giving, one of the most giving and truthful, just loving people, and he loved those kids so much that took his washed the blood that was on his soaked into his shirt, put on a new shirt, took his body, put it on top of the bed. We went out. I asked Hernan, and we went out and we got a casket and we wheeled it back to the Vicentina and bought candles and cleaned him up for the funeral. Put him inside the casket, put on the casket, and just fell apart.
With each paycheck, Juarez had bought something for a member of the family, a refrigerator for Mrs. Panameño, medicine and clothing for the children, and school clothes for his new nieces and nephews. Eventually, the Panameños went to El Salvador's Supreme Court, seeking an indictment against their own son, Chepe, for the murder of Juarez. But Chepe remains a free man.
I knew that Chepe would not be arrested because he was in the civil defense, and you don't, if you kill someone in El Salvador, and if you're in the military, it's a credit card. It's carte blanche to kill. If you're in the military, and it's not a murder. It's not a crime. Luckily, I was able to do something, and Chepe was eventually thrown into jail for 2 weeks. That was his punishment for taking someone's life.
All of us felt the loss of a friend with Juarez's death, but photographer Milt Graham had been especially close to Juarez. He seemed unable to accept the brutal reality of this latest senseless killing. During the funeral preparations, he'd been a tower of strength for the family, contributing virtually all his own money towards the funeral and offering to sell his Nikon camera to help with funeral expenses. Within the days following the funeral, he became increasingly depressed. Disoriented and disillusioned, he attempted suicide by taking an enormous overdose of powerful sedatives. The Panameños rushed him to the hospital in the nick of time.
In El Salvador, you get so depressed, and that was a good way out, you know. In El Salvador, you're in hell, therefore anything you might do is an escape, and that looked pretty good.
In what had become a perverse pattern, the authorities reacted by arresting Graham and placing him in the military prison. With the aid of the U.S. Embassy, he was released from prison on condition that he be deported from El Salvador. For Graham and the Panameño family, it was a tearful farewell.
Leaving them was not to be able to see the kids or talk to Araceli and laugh and of course the tragedy just to know that what the family without their Juarez and now the orphans again was just it was just so tragic that I felt so bad about the kids and Lowry, and who knew what was going to happen to Olgi and Hernan. Was he going to be forced into something? Was someone going to kill him? So the whole thing was, and to leave them, and it was just terrible. I love them, so much.
La Palma. Out of the incredible sadness that had become a way of life for us in San Vicente came those two words, La Palma. Peace talks between the government and the rebels, a fragile hope for peace and an end to the situation. In a bold and unexpected move, President Duarte agreed to hold talks with the guerrilla leaders here in the tiny town of La Palma, and he seemed determined to prove to the outside world that ultimately only Salvadorans could bring an end to the Civil War. But even Duarte's daring peace initiative was overshadowed by the appearance of the leaders of the guerrilla fighters. With the thousands of Salvadorans who crowded into the tiny town, it was as if legends had come to life. The comandantes, those who had dared to pick up the gun against the rich and powerful, were here in the flesh. In a war this bloody, it was hard to believe that only Boy Scouts and priests stood between the two sides. No armed forces, no guns, simply Salvadorans seeking a solution to the situation. And in those brief moments, a tiny spark of that most precious human commodity, hope, had been rekindled. Upon our return to San Vicente, the Panameños brought us back to the harsh world we were living in. They had decided to leave San Vicente. They were giving up years of their lives in a respected place in their community, but they could no longer bear the legacy of loss the little town had left them. With their departure, the Panameños also brought an end to our stay in San Vicente. It seemed senseless and somehow superficial to stay any longer in this sad town whose namesake was the Laughing Saint. We had seen so much, and still it seemed so little. Such a small sampling of San Vicente and the situation.
There's a sunny little country south of Mexico, where the winds are gentle and the waters flow. But breezes aren't the only things that blow in El Salvador. If you took a little lady for a moonlight drive, odds are still good you come back alive. But everyone is innocent until they arrive in El Salvador. If the rebels take a bus on the Grand Highway, the government destroys a village miles away. The man on the radio says now we'll play south of the border. And in the morning the natives say, we're happy we've lived another day. Last night 1,000 more passed away in El Salvador. There's a television crew here from ABC, filming Rio Limpo and the refugees, calling murdered children the tragedy of El Salvador. Before the government camera 20 feet away, another man is asking for continued aid. Food and medicine and hand grenades for El Salvador. There's a thump, a rumble and the buildings sway. A soldier fires the acid spray. The public address system starts to play south of the border. You run for cover and hide your eyes. You hear the screams from paradise. They've fallen further than you realize. Like Poland is protected by her Russian friends, Junta is assisted by America. And if $60 million seems too much to spend in El Salvador, they say for $500 million they could do it right. Bomb all day and burn all night until there's not a living thing